By the time the livestock trailer turned off County Road 18 and rattled down the gravel lane toward Carter Ridge Farm, 3 pickup trucks had already slowed near the fence. Emily Carter saw them from the barn. She stood beside a crooked gate in her father's faded green cap, the bill bleached almost gray along one edge. The cap was too large for her, and always had been. Her father used to push it down over her eyes when she followed him through the pasture as a child, then laugh while she pulled it back up. Now there was nobody left to laugh. At 24, Emily had inherited the cap, the farm, the debts, and nearly every problem her father had been trying to outrun before his heart finally gave out. The trailer backed toward 60 acres of the worst ground on the property. The land beyond the gate hardly looked like pasture anymore. Young eastern red cedar crowded the slopes. Blackberry canes twisted through old wire. Sumac, ragweed, elm sprouts, and thorny brush filled the open ground where cattle had once grazed. In some places, the vegetation stood shoulder high. 3 weeks earlier, the bank's appraisal had described that section as poor grazing ground with little productive value. That morning, Emily opened the trailer. 280 goats poured out. They were not impressive animals. Most were thin commercial does and young meat goats bought cheaply from 2 dispersal sales. Their winter coats were rough. A few were narrow across the back. Several still carried old sale tags in their ears. For a moment, the herd stopped in a loose cluster. Then one doe stretched her neck toward a blackberry cane. Another reached for sumac. Within minutes, the animals were eating the very plants that had swallowed the farm. Emily leaned both hands against the gate. Her father's gloves were still in the truck. She had stopped wearing them because the fingertips were splitting open. These days, she preferred to work barehanded whenever she could. Wire cuts, calluses, grease, and cedar scratches had already changed her hands from the soft ones she remembered having at 20. Across the road, one of the pickups slowed almost to a stop. Emily did not look up. She knew what the county saw. A young woman with almost no cash left had just spent a dangerous amount of money on 280 goats and released them onto land the bank considered barely worth grazing. What made the decision seem even more foolish was that she was not preparing the acreage for wheat, corn, soybeans, or hay. Instead, she spent the next week driving steel posts, unrolling temporary electric fence, dragging black water line through the brush, and dividing the neglected acreage into paddocks. She did not explain herself, because from where everyone else stood, Emily had just turned her father's failing farm into an experiment. But from where she stood, 60 acres of worthless weeds looked like something else. Feed. 3 years earlier, Carter Ridge had still belonged to her father in every practical sense. Robert Carter had worked that Oklahoma ground since he was 19. The farm had never made the family wealthy, but it had kept them fed and stubbornly rooted to the same ridge through low cattle prices, ice storms, dry summers, broken balers, and seasons when the numbers barely worked. Then his heart began to fail. At first, the changes were small. He stopped lifting mineral sacks without resting. He took longer walking uphill. He began sitting on the tractor steps after chores, staring across the pasture as if trying to memorize it. Emily came home more often. By the following year, she was handling most of the livestock and machinery, while Robert managed records from the kitchen table. She had grown up on the farm. She knew how to pull a calf, mend fence, change hydraulic hose, and read clouds moving in from the west. But knowing farm work was not the same as carrying an entire farm. Bills arrived whether she felt ready or not. Weather moved whether she had a plan or not. And banks measured survival in numbers, not memories. One dry summer burned down much of the usable pasture. Feed costs climbed. The old John Deere developed a hydraulic leak, then a transmission problem. A thunderstorm peeled tin from the barn roof. Cattle prices weakened at exactly the wrong time. Robert died the following winter. Emily inherited 96 acres, an old farmhouse, tired machinery, worn fences, exhausted pasture, and approximately $74,000 in farm debt. The banker did not threaten foreclosure that first meeting. He did something quieter. He slid the numbers across the desk and gave her time to prove the farm could still service its debt. Time sounded merciful until Emily understood what it meant. It meant the responsibility for deciding whether Carter Ridge lived or died now belonged entirely to her. A local buyer had already shown interest in the northern acreage. The offer was low. Everyone knew the brush-covered ground was not worth prime farmland prices. But selling it would have reduced the debt enough to make the bank comfortable. Emily refused. Her grandfather had bought that section before her father was born. Robert had rebuilt fence there with her when she was 13. She could still remember his hands around a pair of fencing pliers, thick fingers dark with rust and dirt, showing her how to twist wire without wasting motion. Those hands had seemed indestructible then. By the end of his life, Emily had watched them tremble while lifting a coffee cup. She could not sell the ridge yet. The problem was that keeping it made very little financial sense. Cattle had overgrazed the easiest areas while ignoring much of the woody vegetation. Cedar spread. Blackberry thickened. Brush stole sunlight from grass one patch at a time until nearly 60 acres were producing far less than they once had. Clearing it mechanically would cost money she did not have. Chemical control would bring another bill. Either way, she would still need fuel, equipment, labor, and reseeding. For several weeks after her father's funeral, Emily searched through drawers and file cabinets for anything that might help. She found extension bulletins, old cattle receipts, handwritten rainfall records, machinery manuals with grease fingerprints in the margins. Then, beneath a stack of county tax papers, she found one of her grandfather's notebooks. Its cover was soft at the corners. The pages smelled like dust, oil, and the inside of an old barn. Most of the entries were ordinary: rainfall, calving dates, hay yields, fence repairs. But scattered among them were notes about a small goat herd he had kept decades earlier. He had written down what they ate: blackberry, sumac, young elm, weeds cattle walked past, brush growing along the creek. He had even made short notes about how quickly certain plants returned after browsing. Emily began reading everything she could find about goats, rotational browsing, targeted grazing, and brush suppression. The idea grew slowly. Instead of paying someone to destroy the vegetation, she could buy animals able to convert it into meat. Instead of treating brush removal as an expense, she might turn the brush itself into part of the farm's feed supply. The idea was not magic. It was not even entirely new. That was what Emily liked about it. It felt less like inventing something and more like uncovering something the farm had forgotten. That was how 280 goats arrived at Carter Ridge. The reaction around town was exactly what she expected. At the feed store, older cattlemen watched her stack goat mineral in the pickup. At the diner, people speculated about how long it would take before the animals escaped. Some expected parasites to tear through the herd. Others assumed she would spend so much on hay that the experiment would collapse before August. A few felt sorry for her. Others watched with the quiet interest people sometimes reserve for a failure they believe is already decided. Farm country remembers mistakes. It remembers who bought land too high, who held cattle too long, who planted before a late freeze, who borrowed for machinery they could not afford. Now Carter Ridge had become a story people were waiting to finish. Emily gave them very little. Every morning before sunrise, she checked water, then fence, then goats. She learned which does tested the electric line. She watched eyelids for anemia and checked body condition with her fingertips along their backs. She recorded where browse was dense, where grass remained underneath, and how quickly plants returned after grazing. Most importantly, she kept the herd moving. The goats never stayed in one section long enough to strip everything to bare soil. They took blackberry leaves, young cedar tips, ragweed, sumac, and elm shoots. Then Emily moved them. The plants tried to recover. Weeks later, the goats returned and took the regrowth again. Every new shoot forced the plant to spend stored energy from its root system. Every second browsing weakened it a little more. The results were almost invisible at first. A little more sunlight reaching the ground, a path appearing through what had been a wall of blackberry, thin grass showing beneath hoofprints, a cedar sapling turning dull and brittle. Emily recorded all of it: rainfall, occupation dates, recovery periods, animal weights, feed purchases, fuel, veterinary costs. There was nothing romantic about many of those days. In May, several goats showed signs of parasite trouble. She separated them, changed paddocks, treated the animals that needed it, and watched several $100s disappear from an account already too small. In June, the water pump failed during a run of 90-degree afternoons. She spent half a night under a weak shop light with mud drying on her knees. A week later, temporary fence went down and 27 goats slipped into an adjoining field. She found the last one close to midnight. By sunrise, she was back outside. But by midsummer, work was no longer the hardest part. Uncertainty was. One Friday afternoon, Emily drove into town to make a payment at the bank. She had calculated the amount 3 times before leaving home. Inside, the air conditioning felt too cold against her sunburned arms. The banker pulled up her account. Emily watched his eyes move across the screen. There was no confrontation, no raised voice. That almost made it harder. Her loan was still current, but barely. Her operating cash had fallen much faster than she had planned. The goat market had softened. The tractor needed another repair. Hay prices were beginning to rise. The banker reminded her that the land offer was still available. Emily left without changing her mind. But for the first time, she did not feel certain that refusing had been brave. It might simply have been stubborn. She drove home with both hands tight on the steering wheel. The faded green cap sat on the passenger seat. She had taken it off inside the bank because wearing her father's cap there made her feel 12 years old. Halfway home, she pulled the pickup onto the shoulder beside an empty wheat field. The engine idled. Heat shimmered above the road. Emily looked at her hands. There was a split across one knuckle from fencing wire. Dirt was packed under her nails. A dark bruise crossed the heel of one palm. Her father's hands had looked like that almost every day of his life. For years, she had believed those hands meant certainty. Now she understood they probably had not. Maybe he had been afraid too. Maybe every drought, every loan renewal, every broken tractor had frightened him in ways he simply never showed her. The thought did not comfort Emily. It made her chest tighten, because for the first time since inheriting Carter Ridge, she allowed herself to imagine losing it. She imagined the northern ridge carrying another family's cattle. She imagined the barn torn down. She imagined driving County Road 18 years later and slowing near land that used to have her name on the mailbox. Worst of all, she imagined that perhaps everyone in town had been right. Perhaps she was simply too young to know the difference between persistence and refusal to admit failure. She sat there until the truck's air conditioner began blowing warm. Then she put the green cap back on and drove home. That evening, the sky darkened with clouds. Thunder rolled somewhere west of the farm. Emily stood in the yard watching the horizon. The clouds divided before reaching Carter Ridge. Rain fell miles north. Not one meaningful drop reached her ground. That night, she sat alone at the kitchen table. Bank papers lay on one side. Her grandfather's notebook sat on the other. Her own notebook was open in the middle. The house was so quiet she could hear the refrigerator cycling on and off. Emily took out a sheet of paper. At the top, she wrote the acreage she could sell. Below it, she wrote the expected price. Then the amount of debt the sale would remove. She stared at the figures for a long time. All she needed to do was sign. The farm would shrink, but the pressure might ease. Her hand rested on the paper. For several minutes, she came closer to giving up the ridge than anyone in town would ever know. Then her eyes moved to her own field notes. Paddock 1. Nearly 60 days of rest. Blackberry regrowth reduced. Ground cover improving. Purchased feed lower than projected. Average animal condition holding. She turned back several pages. The first paddock photographs were clipped inside. Dense brush. Almost no visible grass. Emily rose from the table, found a flashlight, and walked outside. It was after 10. The air felt dry and warm. She crossed the yard, past the barn, and climbed through the fence. In the beam of the flashlight, the first paddock did not look miraculous. It looked rough, uneven, half-recovered. But when Emily crouched down and pushed aside dead blackberry stems, she found grass. Not much. Enough. She rubbed a blade between her fingers. Then she pressed her palm against the soil. It was cooler than the bare ground near the road. For the first time that day, she felt something other than fear. Not confidence. Evidence. Emily went back inside. She folded the sheet with the land sale numbers in half. Then she put it away. At sunrise, she moved the goats again. A few weeks later, the rain stopped completely. By late July, the county was drying out fast. Ponds shrank. Grass faded from green to gray-green and then brown. Cattlemen began feeding hay weeks earlier than normal. By August, round bales had become expensive enough to change decisions. Trailers started appearing at the livestock auction more frequently. People who had planned to hold cattle through fall began selling. The drought did not spare Carter Ridge. Dust still lifted behind Emily's pickup. The pond still dropped. The grass still slowed. But the goats had one advantage cattle did not. They looked upward. Sumac held leaves after pasture grass browned. Elm sprouts remained usable. Blackberry stayed green in shaded areas. Deep-rooted woody plants continued producing browse long after shallow-rooted grasses had stalled. The vegetation everyone had treated as proof of worthless land became emergency forage. Emily tightened the rotation. She watched the animals constantly. She hauled water. She bought supplemental feed where necessary. But she did not face the same hay demand she would have faced with cattle. The goats kept browsing, and as the drought deepened, people began noticing. At first, the change in attitude was almost invisible. A pickup stopped one morning outside the fence instead of continuing down the road. The driver stayed only a few minutes. The following week, another neighbor came by to look at the paddocks from the lane. No one announced that Emily had been right. No one needed to. They had simply stopped laughing. The bank was slower. When Emily brought in another payment, the banker still looked at numbers before land. Her balance had improved only slightly. The debt had not vanished. The goats had not yet turned into a miracle. The bank wanted results, not greener blackberry patches. Emily understood, so she kept working. Then autumn rain finally came. It arrived one evening in thick sheets, hammering the metal roof and filling the gutters until water spilled over the edges. Emily woke before dawn. By first light, the farm smelled like wet cedar and red dirt. Within days, the rested paddocks began responding. Grass rose through places that had been dark beneath brush the previous spring. Several stands of young cedar had weakened badly. Blackberry remained, but it no longer dominated entire sections. For the first time in years, Emily could stand at one fence line and see across ground that had once been nearly closed by vegetation. That winter, she sold the first serious group of market goats. The trailer left Carter Ridge heavier than the one that had arrived months earlier. Emily stood in the sale yard afterward watching the numbers on the settlement sheet. The check was not enough to save the farm, but it was enough to make the next decision possible. She paid down part of the operating balance. She kept her strongest females. Then kidding season arrived. For several weeks, the barn filled with the small sounds of newborn goats. Emily slept in short stretches. She carried weak kids into the mudroom on cold nights. She bottle-fed 2 by the kitchen stove. She lost some animals despite everything she did. She saved others she had expected to lose. By spring, the herd had become something different from the thin group people remembered arriving the year before. It was becoming an enterprise. The next opportunity came from a neighbor named Harris who owned brushy ground along a drainage. He had watched Emily's farm through the drought. He had also priced mechanical clearing. Instead of hiring a crew, he asked whether her goats could do anything with the brush. Emily walked the property before agreeing. She studied the plants, the fencing, the water, the road access. Then she calculated what moving the herd would cost her. A week later, a livestock trailer left Carter Ridge for the first paid grazing job. The arrangement felt almost backward. Harris paid Emily to put goats on vegetation she otherwise would have had to feed them to replace. The goats gained forage. His brush was reduced. Emily received a check. The amount was modest, but when she deposited it, the banker noticed the source. For the first time, he asked her to explain what targeted grazing meant. He did not suddenly become a believer. He asked about liability, fence costs, transportation, labor, whether the income could repeat. Emily answered with records, not optimism. Records, dates, weights, expenses, photographs, contracts. The same notebook people had once treated as evidence of inexperience began making her difficult to dismiss. That first grazing job led to another, then another, an overgrown fence line, a neglected pasture, a property where mowing equipment could not safely reach every slope. The goats began earning money in 2 ways. They became more valuable while eating, and sometimes the landowner paid for the eating. Emily still sold market goats when timing made sense. She kept productive females. She culled poor performers. She began arranging sales with more care, instead of sending everything through the nearest auction. Money entered Carter Ridge in uneven waves, rather than one dramatic check. A group of kids sold in spring. A grazing contract paid in early summer. Breeding animals left in fall. Another brush job covered part of the winter feed bill. Each time money arrived, Emily resisted the temptation to make the farm look successful. She did not buy a newer pickup. She did not replace the tractor. She paid the bank. Then she paid it again. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the first goats arrived, the banker drove out to Carter Ridge himself. Emily saw his sedan approaching through dust and almost smiled at how badly it fit the road. He did not stay near the house. She took him to the northern ridge. The 2 of them walked through ground that had once been nearly useless to cattle. It was not manicured pasture. Some cedar remained. Blackberry remained in patches. The land was still rugged, but grass now occupied space that brush had controlled. Portable fence divided grazing sections. Water lines reached areas that had once been ignored. Goats moved through one paddock while another rested. The banker looked longer than Emily expected. He had seen the original appraisal. Now he was standing inside the difference. Even then, the bank did not erase the old judgment overnight. A new appraisal came weeks later. The productive value of the acreage had improved, but more important than the appraisal was Emily's payment history. Her records now showed multiple income streams associated with land previously producing almost nothing. The bank adjusted its view because the numbers had forced it to. The community changed for the same reason, not because Emily gave a speech. Because seasons passed, because the goats survived the drought, because the brush retreated, because trailers left Carter Ridge carrying sale animals instead of foreclosure equipment, because people saw her still there. The first farmer who asked Emily about temporary fencing did so awkwardly. The second wanted to know how she controlled parasites. Another wanted to know how long she rested each paddock. Within a year, the questions no longer sounded like challenges. They sounded like questions. Emily never reminded anyone that they had laughed. She did not need to. Her father had taught her years earlier that arguing over a fence rarely improved the fence. By the time Emily finally sat down and added the numbers from nearly 2 years of livestock sales, breeding stock, and targeted grazing contracts, the gross revenue associated with the goat enterprise had crossed roughly $110,000. She did not stare at the number because it sounded impressive. She stared because she remembered another number, 74,000. The debt she had inherited. The number that had followed her into the barn, into the bank, into bed at night. The $110,000 had not arrived cleanly. Veterinary bills took some, minerals took some, fuel, fencing, hauling, equipment, losses, and feed took more. Not every dollar was profit. But enough remained to do what once seemed impossible. The overdue operating pressure disappeared. Principal fell. The barn roof was repaired. The worst section of north fence was replaced. For the first time since her father died, Emily opened a bank statement without feeling her stomach tighten before reading it. Months later, she made the payment that brought the remaining farm debt down to a level Carter Ridge could carry comfortably. She walked out of the bank, holding the receipt in one hand. The green cap was on her head. The banker did not congratulate her as if she had won a contest. He simply treated Carter Ridge like a viable farm. For Emily, that was enough. That summer, she found her grandfather's notebook again while cleaning the kitchen table. She placed it beside her own. His pages carried faded rainfall records, pasture observations, cattle numbers, and notes about goats written decades before she was born. Her pages carried rotation dates, weights, brush recovery, contract payments, and loan balances. 2 generations of handwriting, 2 different farms, the same ground. Emily turned one of her hands palm up beneath the kitchen light. The skin had thickened along the base of her fingers. A pale scar crossed one knuckle. Another ran near her thumb from barbed wire. For years, she had remembered her father through his voice, his pickup, his chair at the table. Now she understood that she remembered him most clearly through his hands. Hands repairing what could be repaired. Hands touching soil before deciding what it needed. Hands that had kept working even during years when he must have been frightened. Emily closed the notebook. The following evening, she climbed the northern ridge before sunset. The goats moved below her in a loose line, reaching through green growth along the edge of a rested paddock. The old pickup sat beside the fence. The barn roof shone with newer tin where the storm damage had finally been repaired. The tractor was still old. The farmhouse still leaned slightly into Oklahoma wind. Carter Ridge had not become perfect. It had become secure. At the entrance to the lane, the Carter name was still painted across the weathered wooden sign. Emily took off the faded green cap. For a moment, she held it in both hands. The cloth was sweat-darkened along the inside band. One seam had begun to separate near the bill. Her father had worn that cap while teaching her to drive a tractor. He had worn it while repairing fence. He had worn it during dry years when the grass disappeared and during wet springs when mud swallowed the tires. After he died, Emily had started wearing it because it was one of the few things that still smelled faintly like him. Now it smelled like dust, goats, sweat, cedar, and her. She put it back on. Then she rested both hands on the top wire of the fence. They were no longer the hands of the girl who had inherited Carter Ridge. They were scarred now, strong, certain in some places, and still learning in others. Below her stretched the 60 acres the bank had once considered nearly worthless. Emily had never planted a cash crop there. She had not bulldozed it. She had not sold it. She had simply learned to see the land differently. Where others saw brush, she saw forage. Where others saw unwanted animals, she saw tools. Where others saw a debt problem, she saw a system that could slowly turn neglected acres back into productive ground. 280 goats had entered Carter Ridge, looking like one more bad decision made by a young farmer running out of options. They became the animals that fed on the problem itself. They opened the land. They carried value out through the gate, and eventually, they helped keep the Carter name on the property. Emily stood there until the last light settled over the ridge. Then she lifted one hand from the fence and adjusted the green cap against the evening wind. It was the same small motion she had watched her father make thousands of times. Only now, the hand beneath the brim was hers.